The people everyone overlooks are often carrying the stories that change everything. The first rays of morning sunlight spread across the towering glass entrance of Seabrook Luxury Resort as polished fountains shimmered beneath rows of fluttering white flags. Luxury cars rolled through the circular driveway one after another, while uniformed attendants welcomed guests whose names appeared on exclusive reservation lists. Inside the grand lobby, fresh orchids filled the air with a delicate fragrance. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across polished marble floors, and a quiet piano melody drifted through the enormous space. Every detail spoke of elegance, privilege, and effortless perfection. Grace Parker walked through the employee entrance carrying a neatly folded navy apron over one arm. At 33, she had worked at the resort for nearly 7 years, earning the respect of her fellow staff through quiet professionalism rather than loud ambition. This morning, however, she carried one unusual concern. Beside her walked her 11-year-old son, Ethan Parker. His school had closed unexpectedly for a teacher training day, and the elderly neighbor who normally watched him had become ill before sunrise. Grace had exhausted every option before reluctantly asking her supervisor for permission to let Ethan remain inside the employee lounge until her shift ended. The request had been approved, but only because the resort expected an exceptionally busy afternoon and could not afford to lose one of its most dependable waitresses. Ethan smiled reassuringly at his mother as they entered the service corridor. "I will stay out of everyone's way," he promised. Grace gently brushed a strand of light brown hair away from his forehead. "I know you will. Just remember that this is my workplace, not a playground." Ethan nodded. "I brought my history book." He lifted a worn hardcover borrowed from the local library. Grace smiled softly. "That is exactly why I trust you." A few employees greeted Grace warmly as she changed into her crisp uniform, but others looked curiously toward Ethan before continuing their conversations. One server quietly whispered that children did not belong inside places like this. Another shrugged without saying anything. Grace heard the remarks, but chose not to respond. She had learned long ago that dignity often speaks louder than defense. After receiving her assignments for the day, she guided Ethan toward a quiet sitting area beside the main lobby where guests rarely stopped for long. "Stay here, read your book, and if you need anything, find Mrs. Collins at the concierge desk," Grace said. Ethan looked around with wide but respectful eyes. He had never seen a building so beautiful. Tall windows overlooked the ocean where gentle waves reflected the morning sky, while carefully arranged paintings decorated the walls between elegant columns. "I will be fine," he answered. Grace squeezed his shoulder before disappearing into the dining room with a silver serving tray balanced carefully in her hands. Minutes passed as Ethan quietly read beneath the soft music echoing through the lobby. Guests streamed past him carrying designer luggage, expensive handbags, and polished confidence. Some glanced toward the young boy sitting alone. Most never noticed him at all. A small group waiting near the reception desk exchanged brief looks before one woman whispered just loudly enough to be heard, "Someone should tell the staff that the lobby is not a daycare." Another guest chuckled politely before returning attention to his phone. Ethan lowered his eyes to his book without saying a word. His mother had taught him that people often reveal more about themselves than about others through careless comments. He turned another page calmly, unaware that before the afternoon was over, the owner of the entire resort would ignore every important guest in the building and walk straight toward the one person everyone else had chosen not to see. Grace Parker moved gracefully between elegantly dressed guests, balancing polished silver trays with the quiet confidence that came from years of experience. Every greeting carried the same warm sincerity, whether she served a business executive, a retired teacher, or a young family celebrating a vacation. Her professionalism never depended on the size of a person's wallet. Across the lobby, Ethan Parker remained exactly where his mother had asked him to stay. He finished another chapter of his history book before carefully placing a bookmark between the pages. Rather than becoming restless, he slowly wandered only a few steps toward a quiet corner where several framed photographs documented the earliest days of Seabrook Luxury Resort. Most visitors walked past the display without slowing down. Ethan stopped in front of every photograph as though each one contained a hidden story. One faded black and white picture immediately caught his attention. It showed a much smaller building standing on the same stretch of coastline decades earlier. Workers smiled proudly in dusty clothes while holding ordinary construction tools instead of expensive luggage. Standing near the center was a young man shaking hands with an older couple whose faces carried gentle expressions that felt strangely familiar. Ethan leaned closer, studying every detail. Beneath the frame rested a small brass plaque. Time had softened several letters, making some names difficult to read. Before he could finish reading, a concierge approached with a friendly smile. "Do you like old photographs?" she asked. Ethan nodded politely. "They tell stories that people sometimes forget." The concierge looked pleasantly surprised. "That is an interesting way to describe them." Ethan pointed toward the smiling couple. "Who were they?" She stepped closer and narrowed her eyes. "I honestly do not know. Most guests never ask about these pictures anymore." Ethan smiled gently before thanking her. He returned to the nearby chair without another question. At the same time, Grace continued serving guests inside the Ocean View dining room, where conversations centered around investments, luxury travel, and exclusive memberships. She noticed Ethan through the open lobby entrance and felt relieved to see him quietly reading again. One of her co-workers smiled. "Your son is the calmest child I have ever seen." Grace answered softly. "Books have always been his favorite company." Nearby, another employee quietly remarked that children from ordinary families probably found places like this overwhelming. Grace simply continued pouring coffee without responding. Experience had taught her that silence often protected peace better than unnecessary arguments. Meanwhile, a wealthy family entered the lobby wearing designer clothing and carrying expensive shopping bags from nearby boutiques. Their teenage son glanced toward Ethan before whispering something that made his parents smile. As they passed, the father casually remarked, "He looks like he wandered in from somewhere else." Ethan heard every word. He looked down at his book for a brief moment, then calmly returned his attention to the old photograph instead. His expression never changed. He remembered something his mother often said during difficult days. "Never allow another person's opinion to become the mirror that tells you who you are." Those words settled quietly inside his heart once again. Outside, the distant sound of helicopter blades slowly drifted across the ocean breeze. Resort employees immediately exchanged quick glances before checking their watches. Managers straightened their jackets. Security personnel quietly moved toward the front entrance. The atmosphere changed almost instantly, as though the entire resort had been waiting for one important arrival. Ethan looked through the towering glass windows toward the clear blue sky, unaware that within minutes the man stepping off that helicopter would recognize something everyone else had completely overlooked. The rhythmic sound of helicopter blades grew louder until it echoed across the entire coastline, sending gentle ripples across the resort's reflecting pools. Employees instinctively adjusted their uniforms while department managers gathered near the grand entrance with carefully practiced smiles. Guests paused their conversations, many stepping onto the marble terrace to witness the arrival. Luxury vehicles and impressive visitors were common at Seabrook Resort, but the arrival of its owner was still an event that commanded quiet attention. Grace Parker carried a polished silver coffee service toward the Ocean View Lounge, unaware that nearly every conversation around her had shifted toward the same subject. "Mr. Harrison is here," one guest whispered with excitement. Another quietly remarked that the owner rarely visited without an important reason. Grace simply continued her work. She had never met the resort's owner personally. During 7 years of employment, she had only seen his photograph hanging inside the executive conference room. She believed today would be no different. Across the lobby, Ethan Parker returned to the historic display after finishing another chapter of his book. The faded photograph continued drawing his attention. He studied the smiling faces once more, especially the older couple standing beside the young founder. Something about their expressions felt strangely comforting, although he could not explain why. He quietly traced the edge of the brass plaque with his eyes, attempting to read the worn lettering beneath the glass. Before he could make out another name, several elegantly dressed guests gathered nearby while waiting for the owner's arrival. One woman carrying an expensive handbag glanced toward Ethan before looking at her companions. "That child has been sitting here all morning," she said softly, although not softly enough. "Surely the staff has somewhere else they can keep employees' children." A man standing beside her smiled politely. Perhaps they are hoping someone mistakes him for a guest. Light laughter followed. Ethan heard every word. For only a brief moment, sadness crossed his face. Then he gently closed his history book and rested both hands on the cover. His mother had often reminded him that respect begins with how people choose to respond, not how others choose to behave. Instead of looking toward the voices, he quietly returned his attention to the old photograph. Nearby, the friendly concierge who had spoken with him earlier watched the exchange with visible discomfort. She considered saying something but hesitated, uncertain whether doing so might create an unnecessary scene. Ethan spared her the decision by offering a small, reassuring smile. "It is all right," he said calmly. "Sometimes people are too busy to notice everything." The concierge nodded with quiet admiration. "You seem much older than 11. Ethan shrugged gently. "My mom says listening teaches more than arguing." Outside, the helicopter slowly descended onto the private landing area overlooking the ocean. The powerful blades gradually slowed until silence returned with the afternoon breeze. Resort executives immediately formed a welcoming line near the entrance while security personnel respectfully stepped aside. Grace noticed the movement from inside the dining room and briefly glanced toward the windows before returning to her guests. She carefully refilled water glasses, answered polite requests, and carried fresh meals to waiting tables with the same quiet excellence she offered every day. She never imagined that within minutes the owner of the entire resort would walk past every executive, every honored guest, and every carefully prepared welcome simply to reach the quiet boy everyone else had overlooked. Ethan remained seated beside the historic photograph, completely unaware that the approaching footsteps would soon uncover a forgotten story buried beneath decades of silence. William Harrison stepped out of the helicopter with the quiet confidence of a man who no longer needed attention to prove his importance. At 72 years old, the owner of Seabrook Luxury Resort carried himself with calm dignity rather than authority. His silver hair moved gently in the ocean breeze as he thanked the pilot before walking toward the entrance. Resort executives immediately formed a welcoming line. Department heads straightened their jackets. Security officers respectfully stepped aside. Several distinguished guests smiled eagerly, expecting a handshake or at least a brief greeting. William acknowledged each person with a polite nod, but he did not slow his pace. General Manager Robert Mitchell stepped forward holding a leather folder. "Welcome back, Mr. Harrison. We have prepared today's schedule." William accepted neither the folder nor the greeting. Instead, his eyes drifted beyond the crowd toward the lobby windows. From where he stood, he could see a young boy sitting quietly beside the historic photograph display with a worn history book resting on his lap. Something about the scene caused William to pause. "Who is that child?" he asked calmly. Robert looked through the glass doors before answering. "One of our waitresses had an unexpected childcare problem this morning. He has remained very quiet all day. We approved the arrangement because we were short-staffed." William remained silent for a brief moment. "His name?" Robert searched his memory. "I believe it is Ethan Parker." William slowly repeated the surname under his breath. "Parker." The single word seemed to awaken a memory buried beneath many years. Without another question, he stepped past the welcoming committee and entered the lobby. Confused executives hurried after him while guests instinctively moved aside to clear a path. Conversations faded into complete silence as everyone watched the owner ignore every important person waiting to greet him. Grace Parker noticed the unusual movement while carrying a tray of sparkling water through the dining room. She looked toward the lobby and immediately recognized the distinguished gentleman from the framed executive portrait. Her heart skipped with uncertainty. She assumed he was walking toward senior management, not toward the quiet corner where Ethan sat reading. Ethan sensed approaching footsteps and politely closed his book before standing. He had been taught to stand whenever an older person approached. William stopped directly in front of him and looked first at the boy, then at the faded photograph hanging behind him. "You have been studying that picture for quite some time," he said gently. Ethan nodded. "It feels important." William smiled softly. "Most people walk past it without ever looking." Ethan glanced back toward the photograph. "The people in it look proud for a different reason than most pictures I have seen." William's expression became thoughtful. "What do you mean?" Ethan answered honestly. "They look happy because they built something together, not because they owned it." William looked at the old photograph once again. His eyes rested on the smiling older couple standing beside his much younger self. Then he looked back at Ethan with unmistakable curiosity. Around them, the lobby remained completely silent. Guests, employees, and executives watched in disbelief as the owner of the entire resort continued speaking with the quiet boy everyone else had ignored, while Grace stood frozen several yards away, unaware that the next question William Harrison was about to ask would begin uncovering a family story that had been hidden for more than 30 years. William Harrison remained standing before Ethan Parker, his attention never leaving the calm expression on the young boy's face. Around them, the grand lobby seemed to hold its breath. Resort executives exchanged uncertain glances while guests quietly lowered their voices, unable to understand why the owner had ignored every carefully arranged welcome to speak with a child sitting beneath an old photograph. William looked once more at the faded image hanging on the wall before asking gently, "May I ask your full name?" Ethan answered with quiet confidence, "My name is Ethan Parker, sir." William repeated the surname almost to himself. Parker. The name lingered in the silence like an old memory returning home. "And your mother?" Ethan smiled politely. "Grace Parker. She works here." At that exact moment, Grace hurried across the marble floor, still carrying the polished silver tray she had been serving only moments earlier. "Mr. Harrison," she said respectfully, "I am very sorry if Ethan has disturbed anyone. He has tried to stay out of everyone's way." William slowly turned toward her. For several seconds, he simply looked into her face without speaking. Grace lowered her eyes, believing she might have unintentionally violated some important resort policy. Instead, William asked a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. "Grace, were your parents Daniel and Eleanor Parker?" Grace looked up in complete surprise. Very few people outside her family had spoken those names in decades. "Yes," she answered quietly. "They were my parents." William closed his eyes for a brief moment before smiling with unmistakable warmth. "I hoped I was not mistaken." Grace stood speechless. Ethan looked from his mother to William, sensing that an invisible thread had suddenly connected them. William slowly stepped toward the historic photograph and gently pointed to the older couple standing beside his younger self. "Your parents stood beside me on the first morning we began building this resort. We had almost nothing except determination." Grace followed his hand toward the photograph. "They never talked very much about those years," she admitted softly. William nodded. "That sounds exactly like them." He smiled at Ethan before continuing. "Your grandfather spent countless weekends helping us build this place when we could not afford enough workers. Your grandmother welcomed every volunteer with homemade meals even though she never wanted recognition. They believed that people deserved kindness long before success arrived." Grace felt emotion quietly rise inside her. "After they passed away, I found a small box of photographs, but they never explained why this place meant so much to them." William's eyes softened. "Because they never helped for praise. They helped because they believed one honest opportunity could change many lives." He looked back toward Ethan. "When I saw you studying that photograph instead of staring at the luxury around you, I recognized something familiar. Then I heard your last name." The surrounding guests listened in complete silence. Several employees who had quietly judged Grace earlier lowered their eyes with visible embarrassment. William smiled gently before asking Ethan one final question. "Can you tell me why that picture interested you so much?" Ethan glanced once more toward the faded photograph. "Because everyone in it looked like they were building hope instead of buildings." William's expression filled with quiet emotion. "That," he whispered, "is exactly what your grandparents taught me more than 30 years ago." At that moment, every person standing in the lobby realized they were no longer witnessing an ordinary conversation between a resort owner and a young visitor. They were watching a forgotten family legacy quietly return to the very place where it had first begun. William Harrison remained quietly beside Grace Parker and Ethan while the silence inside the grand lobby grew deeper with every passing second. Resort executives no longer worried about schedules or formal greetings. Guests who had arrived expecting an afternoon of luxury now found themselves witnessing something far more valuable. William slowly turned toward General Manager Robert Mitchell. "Would you please gather everyone in the Grand Ocean Ballroom?" he asked calmly. Robert blinked with surprise. "Everyone, sir?" William nodded. "Employees, department heads, and guests if they wish to attend." There is something that should have been said many years ago. Within minutes, the spacious ballroom filled with quiet curiosity. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm afternoon sunlight across elegantly dressed visitors, while resort employees stood respectfully along the walls. Grace remained near the back of the room, hoping not to draw attention to herself, but William gently motioned for her and Ethan to join him near the front. She hesitated before walking forward with calm dignity, her son quietly beside her. William stepped onto the small stage and looked across the audience. Most of you know this resort because of its beautiful coastline, its service, or its reputation, he began. Very few know how uncertain its future once was. The room became completely silent. William continued in the same gentle voice. 34 years ago, Seabrook Luxury Resort existed only as unfinished walls, unpaid invoices, and impossible dreams. Investors were leaving. Construction slowed. Many believed the project would never open. He paused before looking toward Grace. During those difficult months, two people appeared every weekend without asking for recognition. Daniel Parker repaired equipment, carried supplies, and encouraged exhausted workers. Eleanor Parker prepared meals for volunteers and welcomed every frightened employee with kindness that made them feel they belonged. Grace lowered her eyes as quiet emotion filled her heart. William smiled warmly. I offered to place their names on the dedication plaque. They politely refused. They told me that buildings should remember hope, not individual pride. A soft murmur spread through the audience. Several longtime employees looked toward the historic photograph displayed on a large screen behind the stage. William continued. Today, many people admire this resort because it became successful. Daniel and Eleanor believed in it when success did not yet exist. He turned gently toward Ethan. Looking at this young man today reminded me of them immediately. The same quiet patience, the same thoughtful eyes, the same habit of noticing people instead of luxury. Grace looked at her son with quiet gratitude. Ethan simply listened, holding his history book close against his chest. William then faced the audience once again. Grace has worked inside this resort for 7 years. She never once mentioned who her parents were. She never asked for special treatment. She never expected anyone to remember. Several employees exchanged embarrassed glances as they reflected on careless comments made earlier that morning. William's expression remained peaceful rather than critical. That silence tells us everything about the values her parents passed to the next generation. He slowly stepped down from the stage and stood beside Grace instead of above her. Today I am not recognizing a waitress because she works here. I am honoring a family whose kindness helped build this place long before any of us enjoyed its success. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then one employee quietly began applauding. Another joined. Within seconds, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. The applause echoed through the elegant hall, not celebrating wealth, influence, or social status, but honoring a quiet family whose greatest contribution had always been invisible until the truth finally found its way home. The standing applause continued far longer than anyone expected. One by one, guests who had entered the ballroom believing they were attending an ordinary gathering found themselves applauding something far more meaningful than luxury or success. Grace Parker stood quietly beside Ethan, her hands folded gently before her, never seeking attention even as every eye in the room rested upon her family. She looked toward the floor for a moment, remembering the simple lessons her parents had repeated throughout her childhood. They had always believed that gratitude should be received with humility, never with pride. William Harrison waited patiently until the applause slowly faded. His warm smile remained unchanged as he looked across the audience. Today, he said softly, every person in this room has witnessed something that should never have been forgotten. He turned toward Grace before continuing. Your parents helped create more than a resort. They helped create a culture where people mattered before profits did. Grace answered quietly. They would have wanted everyone to keep serving others without expecting anything in return. William nodded with admiration. That is exactly why they deserve to be remembered. Several employees lowered their heads, reflecting on how easily they had judged Grace only hours earlier. The concierge who had spoken kindly with Ethan approached first. Mrs. Parker, she said sincerely, I wish I had done more this morning. I noticed what happened, but I stayed silent. Grace smiled gently. You treated Ethan with kindness. Sometimes one kind conversation is enough to remind someone they are not alone. The concierge's eyes filled with grateful emotion. Soon afterward, the guest who had whispered careless remarks in the lobby slowly stepped forward. The woman carrying the designer handbag looked genuinely ashamed. "I judged your son before I knew anything about him," she admitted quietly. "I saw his clothes instead of his character. I hope you will forgive me." Grace looked at Ethan before answering. Everyone deserves the opportunity to become better after learning the truth. Ethan smiled softly. "My mom says people can always choose differently tomorrow." The woman nodded gratefully, deeply moved by the gentle response. William watched the exchange with peaceful satisfaction. "That," he said to everyone gathered nearby, "is how dignity changes hearts. Not through embarrassment, through grace." General Manager Robert Mitchell stepped beside William, holding a small wooden presentation box that appeared far older than the resort itself. William accepted it carefully before opening the lid. Resting inside was an original brass room key attached to a polished wooden tag engraved with the number 1. The metal showed the gentle marks of time. "When the resort welcomed its first guests," William explained, "this was the very first room key ever issued. I kept it because it reminded me where everything began." He turned toward Grace. "Today it belongs with the Parker family. Not because it unlocks a room, but because it represents the values that unlocked the future of this place." Grace accepted the small box with visible emotion. "I do not know what to say." William smiled warmly. "Your parents already said everything through the lives they lived. You simply continued their example." Ethan looked carefully at the old brass key before quietly asking, "Can I help keep it safe?" Grace placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "One day it will be yours to protect." William's eyes reflected quiet pride as he looked at the young boy. "I have no doubt you will guard the legacy just as faithfully as those who came before you." Around them, the atmosphere inside the ballroom had completely changed. No one saw a waitress standing beside her son anymore. They saw a family whose greatest inheritance had never been wealth, influence, or recognition. It had always been the quiet courage to live with kindness when no one was watching, allowing ordinary choices to become an extraordinary legacy carried from one generation to the next. The atmosphere inside the Grand Ocean Ballroom remained warm long after the applause had faded. Conversations that once centered on luxury vacations and exclusive memberships had quietly transformed into discussions about integrity, gratitude, and the remarkable family who had never asked to be recognized. Grace Parker carefully closed the small wooden presentation box containing the original brass room key and held it with both hands as though she were protecting a piece of living history. Ethan stood beside her, his history book tucked beneath one arm, still trying to understand how an ordinary morning had become an unforgettable day. William Harrison stepped back onto the stage with the same calm presence that had guided the resort through decades of success. He looked across the audience before speaking once more. "Today has reminded me that every lasting institution must continue honoring the values that created it," he said. "Without those values, beautiful buildings become nothing more than expensive walls." The audience listened in complete silence. William continued, "For that reason, I would like to announce something that was never included in today's program." Several members of the executive team exchanged curious glances. William smiled gently before turning toward Grace and Ethan. "Beginning next year, Seabrook Luxury Resort will establish the Parker Legacy Scholarship. Each year it will support young students whose families quietly serve their communities with honesty, compassion, and humility." A wave of heartfelt applause filled the ballroom once again. Grace looked genuinely overwhelmed. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, "my parents would never have wanted attention focused on them." William nodded with understanding. "This scholarship will not celebrate their names. It will celebrate the values they passed forward. That is the difference." Ethan looked toward his mother with quiet admiration. She simply smiled and gently squeezed his shoulder. "The greatest gift is knowing that kindness continues," she whispered. William invited several longtime employees to join him on the stage. Among them were housekeepers, gardeners, kitchen staff, maintenance workers, and front desk associates who had dedicated decades of service to the resort. "These people," William said warmly, "carry the same spirit that Daniel and Eleanor Parker carried many years ago. They remind us every day that excellence begins with character." Every employee received warm applause from the guests. Grace recognized many familiar faces, people she had worked beside for years without seeking recognition themselves. The concierge who had first spoken kindly to Ethan smiled proudly from the front row. General Manager Robert Mitchell then approached the microphone. On behalf of every employee, he said sincerely, I want to thank Grace for quietly reminding all of us why service is never measured only by uniforms or job titles. His words were followed by another standing ovation. Ethan looked around the ballroom, noticing that the same people who had overlooked him that morning were now smiling with genuine respect. He leaned toward his mother and whispered, Nothing about us changed today. Grace smiled softly. No, only what people finally chose to see. William heard the quiet exchange, and his eyes reflected gentle satisfaction. That may be the most important lesson anyone will remember, he said. As afternoon sunlight poured through the towering windows overlooking the ocean, the ballroom felt different from the place it had been only hours earlier. Pride had quietly given way to humility. Status had surrendered to gratitude. And every person present understood that the strongest legacy is never built by wealth alone. It is built by ordinary people who choose kindness so consistently that one generation quietly inspires the next without ever asking to be remembered. As the final guest slowly departed Seabrook Luxury Resort, the evening sun settled gently over the ocean, bathing the white buildings in warm golden light. The fountains continued flowing quietly while the last notes from the lobby piano drifted through the peaceful air. Staff members returned to their daily responsibilities, but something inside the resort had changed forever. People who had arrived believing luxury was measured by appearance were leaving with a different understanding of what true greatness looked like. Grace Parker carefully folded her navy apron after completing the final task of her shift. She placed it neatly inside her locker before joining Ethan near the employee entrance. The small wooden presentation box rested safely inside her bag, while Ethan still carried his worn history book beneath one arm. Neither of them spoke for several moments as they stepped outside together. The ocean breeze felt calm, carrying away the tension that had filled the day only hours earlier. William Harrison stood waiting beneath the covered entrance, no longer surrounded by executives or security personnel. For the first time that afternoon, he stood alone. Grace smiled respectfully as she approached. Thank you for everything, she said quietly. William gently shook his head. Do not thank me. Today I simply corrected something that should have been corrected many years ago. Grace looked toward the ocean before answering. My parents never expected anyone to remember. William smiled warmly. People like your parents never work to be remembered. That is exactly why history must remember them. Ethan stepped forward holding the small brass room key in both hands. I will take care of it, he promised. William looked at the young boy with grandfatherly affection. I know you will. But remember something even more important. Ethan listened carefully. Objects preserve history. Character preserves legacy. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Then I will protect both. William's eyes reflected quiet pride. That is exactly what your grandparents would have hoped to hear. General Manager Robert Mitchell walked outside carrying a framed photograph wrapped carefully in protective paper. Mrs. Parker, he said respectfully, we restored a copy of the original construction photograph this afternoon. We would be honored if your family accepted it. Grace carefully accepted the gift, her eyes lingering on the familiar faces of Daniel and Eleanor Parker standing beside a much younger William Harrison. This belongs in our home, she whispered. It always did. Robert smiled sincerely. And another copy will remain inside the resort, with every name fully restored beneath it. Grace thanked him quietly. As the evening grew softer, Ethan looked back toward the grand lobby through the tall glass windows. Earlier that morning, he had sat there feeling invisible. Now he understood that being noticed had never been the greatest gift. Being understood was. He reached for his mother's hand, and together they began walking toward the small parking area where Grace's aging sedan waited beneath the palm trees. They carried no expensive souvenirs, no promises of privilege, and no special advantages for the future. They carried something far more enduring. They carried the quiet example of two ordinary people whose kindness had survived across generations without asking for recognition. William remained standing beneath the entrance until the car disappeared beyond the winding coastal road. Only then did he look back at the resort that had become successful because countless unseen hands had believed in it before anyone else did. A beautiful building could impress the eye, but only grateful hearts could preserve its soul. And as the final sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, everyone whose life had been touched that day understood one simple truth that would remain long after the waves erased every footprint from the shore. The people the world overlooks today may become the reason the world remembers kindness tomorrow.